Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the Middle East on the verge of a wider war. President Trump departing the G7 meeting early to convene his national security team at the White House, calling for Iran's unconditional surrender and facing a major decision tonight on whether to join Israel offensively against Iran. We'll discuss what's at stake with retired Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula.
President Trump's hasty exit leaves unfinished business between the U.S. and the world's top economic powers, from unresolved trade deals to negotiations over additional support for Ukraine. We'll have the latest live from the summit in Banff, Alberta.
And the tax bill facing big changes in the Senate now as Republicans race to strike a compromise before their self-imposed July 4 deadline.
We continue to hear from our members specifically on components or pieces of the bill that they would like to see modified or changed or have concerns about, and we're working through that.
We'll have a closer look at the sticking points with one of its most vocal opponents, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Plus, we'll have a view from the other side of the aisle with Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland.
And a high-profile New York City lawmaker and candidate for mayor arrested by ICE agents outside an immigration court in Manhattan. Why authorities say Brad Landner broke the law and how his campaign is responding.
We start, though, with the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran this evening and the meeting that President Trump held this afternoon with his national security team inside the White House Situation Room. The instability in the Middle East here, paired with several other weak economic indicators today, driving markets down. The S&P 500 down almost 1% or 50 points. Oil prices up with WTI West Texas Intermediate crude oil futures rising about 4% to approach $75 a barrel. Here with the latest is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Mike, it's great to have you here with a critical decision the president is facing tonight.
He is, and it's unclear what is going to emerge from the Situation Room, whether it will be one last chance at diplomacy. But we have seen signs over the past day or so that the president has grown increasingly frustrated with Iran over its refusal to accept what he called the best deal it could get on ending its nuclear program. Tehran has balked, Joe, at the idea that it should give up altogether enrichment of uranium. Iran says that its intentions are civilian in nature. The U.S. and, of course, its top ally in the Middle East, Israel, have their doubts. And this is probably what is propelling the president now to perhaps have a change in thought. We did hear from him overnight as he was returning from the G7. He cut his trip short there. He said he doesn't want a ceasefire. He is not interested in de-escalating the conflict. He wants a real end to the problem. And for him, that is an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions.
So you talked about him speaking overnight. Do you believe that this is pointing to more direct military U.S. involvement?
Well, that is the question right now in the minds of everybody here in Washington, on Wall Street, and certainly in the region. Will the U.S. take this step? So far, President Trump has wanted to keep America on the sidelines when it comes to attacking Iran directly, joining Israel in that part of the conflict. He has, though, encouraged the U.S. and had U.S. military forces participating in the defense of Israel. And yet Iran's balking at accepting this deal. And perhaps there may be some intelligence that we are not aware of that was shared at this Situation Room meeting that Joe was talking about, that the president had this afternoon, that may be influencing a change in his thinking, too. But nonetheless, the U.S. has some assets it can bring to bear that would add a different element altogether to this conflict. And the chief of them, of course, is this bunker buster bomb, the massive ordnance penetrator. It's only a U.S. asset. No other country in the world has this capability to really penetrate deep into bunkers like the one at Fordo in Iran, where Iran does most of its uranium enrichment, Joe.
Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, always great to have your expertise. Thanks so much for being with us. And President Trump's early G7 exit and his follow-up social posts dimmed hopes for a fast diplomatic solution to the Iran-Israel crisis, and oil traders sent prices to the highest in months. Joining us for reaction from that summit is Bloomberg's David Gura, live in Banff, Alberta. David, so much changing so quickly today. How did that affect the summit?
Well, you had all of the remaining world leaders here paying very close attention to what's happening in the Middle East, of course, but what's happening in Washington as well. They are also curious about what the U.S. is going to do here, if they're going to find some sort of diplomatic route to take that's going to lead to some stability between Israel and Iran. They're also curious just about the region more broadly, what's happening there, and paying close attention to it. But all the while, they're going about their business as usual. The focus today was on the conflict in Ukraine, and you had the arrival of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky here in Alberta for these meetings, and they talked an awful lot about what Ukraine needs going forward here in terms of military support, financial support going forward. The first meeting of the day that he had was with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and Prime Minister Carney said there'd be $2 billion of Canadian dollars worth of new support here in military issues. He also talked about sanctions, and that's been a through line over the conversations today as well. What sanctions these nations can put in place on Russia that might bring Russia back to the table. Now, President Trump anointed Scott Bessent his surrogate here at this summit as he left. He's been a participant in all of these meetings. We've seen these statements on all manner of issues: quantum computing, AI, conflict minerals. What we did not get a statement on is a more robust statement on Ukraine. The U.S. was not a signatory to that. So despite those efforts to emphasize the importance of using sanctions to try to get President Vladimir Putin back to the table, they were unsuccessful in convincing the U.S. to do that. We'll see what happens next, what the next chapter is in that regard. Of course, as you know, you've got two senators, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, in the U.S. Senate, who say they have more than enough votes to bring a new sanctions package forward. They've been pressing that with the president. The president has signaled some openness here to more aggressive sanctions on Russia. Seems like that's where this story is going to go next, guys.
Hard to avoid the story surrounding Israel and Iran, David, and it was interesting to see the goodbye messaging here between President Trump and President Emmanuel Macron of France, who suggested that Donald Trump was headed home to maybe get a deal on a ceasefire. The president took to Truth Social after that on his way home and said, publicly seeking, President Emmanuel Macron, publicity seeking, I should say, mistakenly said I left the summit to work on a ceasefire. Wrong. He has no idea why I am now on my way back to Washington. Was there a breakdown in the conversation over what's happening in the Middle East?
You know, it's funny you bring that up because President Macron fielded some questions from reporters today as well, and he's very proud, he said, of his relationship with President Trump. He said that he thinks he has the best one of all European leaders. So he didn't want to opine too much on that statement from the president from Air Force One last night, but he feels confident, I guess, in his assessment of things. It was a very optimistic read of what's happening here when it comes to the president and to the Middle East. I should say there was a more nuanced and perhaps more pessimistic outlook from Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany. He fielded questions from reporters today as well, and he had a much more cautious tone about the situation in the Middle East and suggested that the White House will make its decision on what to do next by the end of the day today. So did you had all of these world leaders kind of opining on what they think the next path forward is going to be here for the White House? But of course, there's only one man who knows what that's going to be. We have yet to hear from him in person today. That's President Trump, of course.
Isn't that right? Bloomberg's David Gura joining us live from the Canadian Rockies. We thank you for your reporting, David, and for a deeper look into the options that the president is weighing tonight. We turn to retired Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power Studies. He planned the U.S. air campaign in Operation Desert Storm over Iraq in 1991 and was director of the Combined Air Operations Center for Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan in 2001. General, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. The president clearly facing a critical decision that he needs to make tonight. His advisors on his national security team are presenting him with a menu of options. I'm wondering what's left to hit when it comes to specifically the nuclear facilities inside Iran. And if the answer is Fordo, can Israel take care of this without the use of U.S. bombers?
Well, first, thanks, Joe and Julie, for having me on. And I think you put your finger on, just where the United States might be able to assist Israel in accomplishing its objectives. I would also offer my own editorial comment in that I think supporting Israel in its efforts to terminate Iran's nuclear capability is not merely a regional security issue. It's a decisive strategic imperative that would dramatically improve global security, preserve the international order, and deter nuclear proliferation around the world. Now, with that said, while the Israeli Air Force on their own can penetrate to significant depths by applying a series of strikes using their own penetrating munitions, the fact of the matter is very deeply and hardened facilities like the Ferdo nuclear facility is upwards of 250 to 300 feet deep and located underneath a mountain. So that requires, or would require, if you're going to use the air option, I mean, there are other means that might be used to disable that facility, but if you're going to use the air option, the 30,000-pound GBU-57, also known as a massive ordnance penetrator, is something that the United States could provide that could quickly damage that facility. So that's probably the biggest thing that's on the table right now. As it was mentioned in your earlier commentary, the United States is already assisting in terms of missile defense on the part of Israel, but it hasn't provided any offensive part yet, and this is where it could do the most work.
General, what is Iran's defensive capability after last year's attacks and what we've seen in the past 5 days? What's left of their capabilities?
Well, hey, Julie, great question in the context of the importance and the significance of the Israeli air attacks and their strategy, because it's a powerful and undeniable reminder that achieving air superiority is not a luxury, but it's a prerequisite for operational success and follow-on strikes and finally, accomplishing the strategic objectives. With respect to what's left, we've already heard a declaration by Prime Minister Netanyahu that Israel's achieved air superiority. Now, that doesn't mean that, all the operations across Iran or that Iran's completely vulnerable, but there are certain locations and places that Israel can operate with impunity. There are probably some others that still have some significant air defenses, but Israel will deal with those. And so I guess that's a longer answer than perhaps you want, but the short answer is they've pretty much taken care of the majority air defense threats, and they'll deal with the other ones that are remaining.
As President Trump says, we now control the skies. General, we've been surging an enormous amount of hardware into the region. We know the USS Nimitz is on its way. More than 24 refueling tankers have been dispatched to Europe, among other material and manpower that have arrived over the past many months here. The New York Times just this evening is reporting that Iran is preparing missile attacks against U.S. bases if the Pentagon, if the president does decide to get involved. Do we have the resources we need now to provide force protection for our bases in Saudi Arabia and throughout the region? Because that sounds like a much wider scope.
It's something that you would expect Iran to say. I mean, they're trying to prevent or deter action on our part. But the short answer to your question is yes. Our facilities and personnel in the Mideast are adequately protected by air and missile defense capabilities.
Do you believe that there is a point that the air wars can simply not accomplish the goal of the mission and it gets much, much larger?
No, I don't. I believe that we need to be careful not to conflate what most Americans, as well as military personnel for that matter, have experienced in the 20 years post 9/11, which were large-scale counterinsurgency operations with very, very different objectives than what we're seeing unfold in the Israeli-Iranian conflict. The fact of the matter is that the lethality of air power can be decisive in achieving strategic objectives. And I'd take you back to 1991. When we defeated Saddam Hussein's ground force of over 500,000 after 43 days of precision airstrikes. The only reason we needed to use surface forces was to, participate in the Great Prisoner Roundup and then reoccupy Kuwait. But that's not the same objectives that Israel has in this particular campaign, which is to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons development aspirations and capabilities. And that can be done principally with an air power strategy, along with small numbers of special operations forces.
Retired Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula, thank you so much for being with us. And coming up, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence startup xAI is working on a major new round of funding, and while blowing through massive amounts of cash. We'll bring you the details. But first, we'll bring you our conversation with one of the Senate tax bill holdouts, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Julie Fine. A live look at the U.S. Capitol, where negotiations over the tax bill are well underway. Senate Republicans can only lose 3 votes to pass their version of the tax bill, and key lawmakers are already voicing their concern.
That includes Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who says he will not support this bill unless it does more to reduce the debt and deficit. We spoke with Senator Johnson a short time ago this afternoon. I started by asking what changes he needs to see to become a yes.
Well, I'm currently a no. I'd like to point out that the ball has only been in the Senate's court a couple of weeks. We had a really good discussion today at lunch. We had Dr. Oz in. We talked about other things we can do to end the abuse of the Obamacare expansion, Medicaid expansion, really threatening benefits for Medicaid patients. So as far as it goes, I think the House bill is something I basically support, but my problem is it just doesn't go far enough. At most, we'll be reducing spending by about $2 trillion over 10 years. We increased spending by more than $2 trillion in 1 year from 2019 to 2020. And, you know, it's a budget reconciliation process. We ought to be talking about numbers. About the only numbers we heard out of the House debate was, you know, the $1.5 trillion. Again, sounds like a lot until you realize it's over 10 years. And 218 and 51. I think we ought to be concentrating on the fact the CBO projects our deficits over the next 10 years, according to their score, $24.1 trillion. So the Biden administration averaged deficits of $1.9 trillion, and that was following the COVID blowout spending spree, bipartisan, uniparty doing it. Previous 7 years, our average deficit was $660 billion. We should have returned to that level, but unfortunately, right now, we seem to be stuck there. I'm just not willing to accept $2 trillion deficits as the new normal as far as the eye can see. Actually, those deficits are going to increase. So we need to address this seriously. You know, my role is to force people to face and acknowledge and start addressing this massive problem.
Well, yeah, so you're showing these 10-year projections to your colleagues, and surely the White House knows about these numbers. Senator, do you believe that President Trump does not care about deficits?
No, he actually does. He pledged in his address to a joint session of Congress that he was going to do what hasn't been done in 24 years, balance the federal budget. I'll be releasing a report hopefully later today. We're putting the finishing touches on it, about a 30-page report where I just go through all the numbers. I put out different scenarios. And unfortunately, even with 3% growth, and by the way, we've averaged 2.21% growth over the last 25 years. It's literally been decades since we've had 10 years of, you know, average 3% growth. But even at that level, all we do is flatten out the deficit curve, somewhere stuck around $2 trillion, $2.1 trillion. Again, that's just not acceptable. Now, I don't believe we can do this all in one fell swoop. My concern about the one big beautiful bill is that it would just be one and done. This would be our only opportunity. We need to seize this opportunity and give ourselves future opportunities to again, communicate to the American public, do the forensic analysis, line by line, program by program, like Dodge did. We have to do that through the entire federal government, through all its programs, all its line items in the budget.
Senator, some of your fellow Republicans, including Senator Josh Hawley, have already expressed concerns about changes to Medicaid. Have you gone to them? Have you sat down with them and said, OK, here are some possible solutions, or let's work together to find areas of cuts?
Well, that's what happened today at lunch. But again, I'll point out, nobody wants to cut benefits to the vulnerable, to disabled children, to women. We're trying to protect and preserve Medicaid for those people. Our problem with Medicaid is the Obamacare addition to it, the Medicaid expansion. For every dollar a state spends on a disabled child, the federal government kicks in $1.33. That was the design of the program. Let states administer it, but have skin in the game so they, try and control it, to prevent ineligible people from being on it. Obamacare, for every dollar that states spend on a single able-bodied working-age childless adult, the federal government kicks in $9. That has led to all kinds of abuse, legalized fraud, the scams of provider taxes, provider fees. By the way, that's not health care. But we're paying, in some cases, 90 cents on the dollar for state fees. And we're also allowing providers to charge, in some cases, 2 to 3 times rates for procedures than we charge for Medicare. So again, it's all kinds of waste, fraud, and abuse. That needs to be curbed. We can't afford to let Medicaid bankrupt the rest of the federal government.
Again, Senator, I understand that you feel that way. Some of your fellow senators do have some concerns. So do you have a group of no's? Is there a group of you that you believe can change this bill?
Yeah, I believe so. There are enough of us that are serious. Some of us have been more outspoken. I think we definitely have enough that have been outspoken to say, no, we're not going to meet this artificial deadline. We need more time to discuss this, to just inform the public. Again, Democrats are going to lie. No matter what we do to Medicaid, they're going to lie that we're cutting benefits for disabled children. We're not. We're trying to encourage single able-bodied, working-age, childless adults to go back to work and get their insurance through a private firm that they're working for, that they're providing for themselves, not on better benefits from the federal government. There are far too many Americans that we incentivize not to work. We have to end that.
Senator Johnson, President Trump, as you know, is facing a huge decision right now. If I can ask you about geopolitics for a moment, on whether the U.S. should join Israel in moving offensively against Iran. Where's your head on this right now? Do you see this as being in the best interest of America? Is this America first, as the president says?
Well, first of all, the world cannot allow Iran to become a nuclear power. That's been their goal all along. I mean, there was no dealing with them to prevent them from doing that. That's what they wanted to do. Iran could be a successful society were not for the Ayatollahs, just their desire to be a nuclear power. So that has to end. I think President Trump has handled this beautifully. I think Israel has done a fabulous job at certainly knocking out the short-term threat. But we need to dismantle it. We need to make sure that Iran can never be a nuclear power. And it's in the benefit of the Iranian people. We have no beef for the Iranian people. They are being repressed by a brutal dictatorial regime. Hopefully that'll end soon for the benefit of the Iranian people.
Senator, is there any appetite from Republicans to authorize a use of force?
Well, first of all, that won't be necessary. The president has his powers, Article 2 powers. The War Power Act itself doesn't require any kind of congressional approval for the first 30 or 60 days. So the president will act in the best interests of the national security, and I will support his action.
So why not join Israel to close the deal and send a couple of B-2s in the air to help them out, Senator? Would you have a problem with that?
Again, we need to dismantle their capability. They've got these underground facilities that might require American weaponry. I'm not sure. I'm not on armed services. I'm not sure whether if we give that weaponry to Israel, whether they can do it or whether we'd have to assist it. But again, I will support the decision of President Trump. I think he's handling this situation masterfully.
Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. We thank the senator for joining us. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation about the Senate's work on the reconciliation bill and a vote that's getting underway right now on the landmark Stablecoin bill, the Genius Act, lauded by the crypto industry and by our next guest. Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland joins us coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We continue to hear from our members specifically on components or pieces of the bill that they would like to see modified or changed or have concerns about, and we're working through that. But at the end, I mean, the goal, as you all know, is to get 51 here in the United States Senate and 218 in the House. And so ultimately, that's the math that I'm working with, that we're all working with. We want to get a bill out of the Senate, through the House, and on the President's desk.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune this afternoon addressing a question about the tax bill holdouts within his own conference. For the latest from Capitol Hill, we turn now to Bloomberg's Erik Wasson. Erik, what is the discussion today on the Hill, especially after hearing what the senator just said?
You know, the tax bill does not have the votes, plain and simple. It can't pass the Senate. It can't pass the House. So it's a really big moment for John Thune, probably the most important moment in his political life to really get this bill through. They want to bring it to the Senate floor next week. You know, it's going to be kind of a Herculean task. They've got, rules issues. They've got to deal with what could be extraneous in this bill has to be taken out, as well as building a coalition. You know, there's 4 or 5 conservatives who are saying they want deeper spending cuts, are advocating for as much as $5 trillion in cuts. He's got to deal with that complaint. And he's also got to deal with moderates who are nervous about the Medicaid cuts. I talked to Lisa Murkowski. She does not like the work requirement. I talked to Jim Justice of West Virginia. He's not comfortable with this change to the Medicaid provider tax, which basically effectively lowers the federal reimbursement for his state, which is reliant on that. So John Thune has got to thread this needle. It's going to be a difficult task. And then after he gets the Senate all on board with it, he's got to negotiate with the House because they're putting in this $10,000 SALT cap that's not acceptable to 5 or 6 Republicans in the House who want this $40,000 SALT cap. So they've got to thread that needle as well.
Sounds like he's got a lot of needles to thread here, Erik, and I do want to point everyone to something that's actually happening right now in the spirit of actually getting work done on Capitol Hill. The Senate has enough votes to pass the Stablecoin bill, the Genius Act. This is the closest thing we've seen to a bipartisan success in this new Congress, is it not?
Yeah, this is a very big deal. You know, I think there's going to be compromise coming out of the House, and I think this is a big boost for the stablecoin industry. And certainly a Congress that's really been divided, riven. The budget process that we're seeing played out on the tax bill is purely a GOP affair. So there is a glimmer of bipartisanship here on the Genius Act.
All right, you have the live view of the Senate floor as we speak with Erik Wasson. Many thanks to Bloomberg's Erik Wasson live on Capitol Hill. For reaction to all of this, we turn to this evening's political panel. Jim Kessler is with us, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Annalise Keller, partner at 7 Letter. Great to have both of you with us, and welcome to the conversation. Jim, you spent enough years in the Senate to appreciate what's happening right now. We've got a lot of questions about the reconciliation debate, but the stablecoin bill is actually passing with Democrats and Republicans. How did this slip through as the bipartisan cause of this new Congress?
It's because it will not change a single American's vote come 2026 or 2028. This is one of those things that pass that are important but don't really have a political benefit for so much for either side. Like, those things can get done, and this is one of those things.
Mm-hmm. So is that what we should expect in the Congress this year? Things getting passed that, like you just said, likely won't affect much?
I don't think so. I think this reconciliation bill is going to continue to move through the Senate. And I know there's a lot of speculation about timing. Some news today that I found especially notable on timing. It seems like that it's getting pushed a little bit further down the line. I think they were initially hoping that a July 4th deadline was what they're going to be getting, and I think it's going to be closer to the end of July. But yeah, it's going to change a lot, but also it's not going to change that much. Maybe something a little bit underappreciated is this reconciliation package. It is preventing a massive tax increase on the American people, but they're already experiencing those tax cuts. So it's not going to be, quite a big change for all Americans that maybe they're talking about.
Well, we just heard from Senator Ron Johnson, who says he's a no. Jim Kessler, you've heard this before. There might be a path to yes, but he told us that he's got enough colleagues who are also prepared to vote no to sink this. I still get back to the central question. Maybe you both want to swing at this. Is there a Republican in the Senate who's ready to vote for a tax hike? That's the equivalent here, right?
Yeah, look, I think there are 2 types of legislators in the Senate and the House on the Republican side for the reconciliation bill. Those that are like, we're going to vote for this, don't worry about me. And then there are the leverage players. Like, I want to be as difficult as possible, and I want to extract what I want out of there. There are a lot of leverage players right now. Now, that can bring down a bill because it can make it more unpopular, and some people's win is somebody else's loss. I think ultimately, in the end, this bill is going to pass. We're going to increase the deficit by $3 trillion. Congratulations, it's a debt bomb.
I mean, I think people like Rand Paul. I don't think he is gettable in the Senate to the point of the debt limit. I think he's never voted for a debt limit, and this bill includes a debt limit increase, which the Republicans put in there, and I think that will stay in there. So, I mean, to your point, I think he's not gettable.
Rand Paul's a safe no, though, right?
Yeah.
He's the Tom Massey of the Senate. It's others we're working on. So what does Ron Johnson get for this stonewalling?
I think I actually think he got a little bit of leverage with the Trump-Elon fight. I kind of think before that happened, he was going to get sidelined, and there were going to probably not be as many meaningful changes to things like SALT and maybe even to Medicaid.
One thing Ron Johnson did also say today is he flat out said, hey, this is an artificial deadline we're working on. The House has obviously said July 4th, but he flat out said that. So obviously this is going to go longer.
Definitely. I absolutely think it's going to take through the end of July. I think it was always kind of a hopeful deadline. And, J.D. Vance and Dr. Oz were in the Senate today. They were having lunch with senators. Obviously, President Trump is occupied, otherwise occupied with what's going on in the Middle East right now. So he sent them in to kind of hopefully get this wrapped up. And I mean, I do think that it's going to go through July, but yeah, it's not the only big pressing deadline is the debt limit. So until we hit that, we're okay on timing. That's the only deadline we have here.
You mentioned geopolitics, the situation involving Israel and Iran. I'd like to ask you both about this, not only through the guise of Capitol Hill, but this afternoon we did hear from Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who talked about the president's decision when deciding how to handle this ongoing escalation. Here's what he said.
I think the president is perfectly within his authority in the steps that he has taken. Clearly, if this thing were to extend for some period of time, there could be a more fulsome discussion about what the role of Congress should be and whether or not we need to take action. But I think right now, let's hope and pray for the best outcome, the best solution. And in my view, that would be Iran coming to the negotiating table and agreeing to end their nuclear program.
Jim Kessler, you've been through a couple of these with big debates over authorizing the use of force. We've asked a few lawmakers about this today. This president clearly is going to be in the clear for 30 to 60 days. But this could drag on longer. It could become much wider. When will lawmakers say, enough, we need to have a say in this?
When the president said today, I want unconditional surrender, that means boots on the ground. I mean, that means occupying a country. Now,
to be clear, no one has said that, though.
No, the president today said, I want unconditional surrender.
But we keep hearing never boots on the ground.
Right, but that's what that means. Like, you surrender to an army. So we have to find out actually what the president really means. Now, the truth is, the first 6 months of the Trump presidency, the louder he talks, the softer the action is, generally. But yes, the president would be able to do a targeted military strike on Iran under his authority, for sure.
Ron Johnson, though, today saying he completely supports what the president's doing and what the president decides to do. Do you think that will follow with the rest of his party? Or do you think he'll have a harder time getting everyone on board?
There are a few grumblings among the Republican Party, I think, right now. For the most part, they're giving President Trump leeway. But I do think, depending on how, his measured approach has been helpful. But there have been those like the Tucker Carlson, some of the folks who are pushing the America First agenda, who see the concern that if Donald Trump continues to engage in the region, that this would be, something that they would have a hard time supporting. And I think Trump himself is a little bit conflicted, frankly. I think he wants to be a peacemaker. I think he wanted a deal with Iran. I don't think he, really wants to. I don't think he wants to put boots on the ground. I don't think that's what he wants.
Deeply conflicted, isn't it? We hear from Tucker Carlson. The president's calling him out on Truth Social. I mentioned Tom Massey already. Marjorie Taylor Greene, J.D. Vance with a long missive today to have faith in the president, even though we heard no new wars repeatedly over the course of this campaign. As a Republican, do you worry about that mission creep when it comes to America First?
As a Republican, I think most Republicans, myself included, are going to give him some leeway. I think he's been pretty measured with his response. And I think until there is something that, really if this does drag on, depending on what this looks like in the coming weeks, I think people are going to be willing to give him that space. But, J.D. Vance coming out and others coming out talking about what Donald Trump is saying and sort of giving him that cover does signal to me that there are concerns and that he's hearing things from those MAGA folks in the party. I mean, and they're saying them publicly. Something to watch.
Jim Kessler and Annalise Keller, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate having both of you here today. And now to some other stories we've been following here at Bloomberg. Elon Musk's artificial intelligence startup xAI is burning through $1 billion a month, with expected losses for the year to top $13 billion. To cover that gap, the company is in talks to raise $9.3 billion through in debt and equity, with plans to spend over half of it in the next 3 months. The losses are due in part to the huge costs all AI companies are facing as they build server farms and buy the specialized computer chips that are needed to train advanced AI models, including xAI's Gronk.
Just breaking this evening, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was transported by ambulance to the hospital here in Washington. According to CNN, Noem has been conscious at the hospital, we understand, and has spoken with her security detail. We'll let you know if we learn more. And Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is now considering revamped policies to make it more difficult and expensive for pharmaceutical companies to advertise directly to patients in what would be a major disruption to the $10 billion industry. One of the policies would require greater disclosures of side effects in ads, making ads longer and therefore more expensive. Another would end the industry's ability to deduct direct-to-consumer advertising as a business expense for tax purposes. The U.S. and New Zealand are the only two countries where it's legal for drug companies to advertise directly to patients.
And the Supreme Court has been asked to consider President Trump's tariff policy, a case that could have major economic implications around the world. The request was made by two educational toy makers who say President Trump's justification of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to implement the tariffs are having such a dire impact that the court should intervene immediately. If the request to expedite the case is granted, the court could rule by the end of the year. A federal appeals court in a separate case has said the tariffs could stay in effect until the panel hears arguments July 31st. Coming up, we'll turn to our conversation on the Senate's proposed tax bill changes when we assemble our political panel. But first, New York City mayoral candidate Brad Landner was arrested outside an immigration court in Manhattan earlier today. We'll bring you the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
At that elevator, I was separated from someone named Edgardo, who I had just met a couple of minutes earlier. Edgardo is in ICE detention, and he's not going to sleep in his bed tonight. So far as I know, he has no lawyer. He has been stripped of his due process rights by a government and a judge that owe him a credible fear hearing.
That was New York City Comptroller and mayoral candidate Brad Lander this afternoon after he was arrested outside of an immigration court in Manhattan. Lander was detained by ICE agents, according to his campaign, and posted the video of the incident to his social media. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Myles Miller, who covers Homeland Security. Myles, what exactly happened? Can you break it all down for us and how it will affect the election coming up quickly?
Right, yeah. So Brad Lander, for the Bloomberg audience, is the steward of the fourth largest pension fund in the United States. And he has made sort of a big effort in his office to stand up for immigrant rights. And because of that, he has been down at immigration court for weeks, physically taking folks who have gone through the process and no longer have immigration cases and trying to walk them out of the court. This morning, he was in immigration court in Manhattan, is attempting to walk one of two people out of court, and that is linking arms with them. And that is the moment when he is confronted by ICE. And at that same moment, ICE tried to put him under arrest. There was a scuffle, a back and forth, and the Department of Homeland Security told us this afternoon that he was initially charged with assault for what he did with those ICE agents. When he came out of ICE detention with the governor said he is no longer facing any charges. So this really gets to the heart of the issue between ICE and local lawmakers. They have been saying, do not stand in the way of us doing our ICE enforcement. They've been going to 26 Federal Plaza here in Manhattan in order to get people who are on detainers after they go to court. the gentleman who Brad Lander had linked arms with was told by a judge that he no longer had status. He had no idea what that meant. And so he was trying to walk out of court with Brad Lander, and that is when that happened.
Myles, thank you so much for the reporting. Bloomberg's Myles Miller with us live from New York. On to Capitol Hill, and the story that we've been following, the Genius Act. Legislation to create a regulatory framework for stablecoins just passed the Senate. It just happened moments ago. 68-30 the count. Take a listen to Republican senators on Bloomberg talking about this landmark piece of crypto legislation.
This is an opportunity to modernize our payment system, take us into the 21st century. My goal is to make certain that the stablecoin legislation passes and that we avoid a situation where it gets cluttered up or bogged down with a number of amendments that could be unrelated to this.
We have worked long and hard to bring Democrats to the place where they can vote for cloture. We have generally agreed to many of the amendments they wanted. There were concerns about illicit finance. We've addressed some of those.
We looked at 80 amendments on the Genius side. We voted on 40 of those amendments. We included multiple amendments, which made the Genius Act even better.
Those were Republican senators and banking committee members. Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, Cynthia Loomis of Wyoming, and Tim Scott of South Carolina within the past few months discussing the progress on the Genius Act, which passed in the Senate just moments ago. Joining us now live on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland. She is a member of the Senate Banking Committee. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an exciting afternoon.
It is an exciting afternoon for you. You were very involved with this bill. I have to say, this one seemed to hit the sweet spot of bipartisanship. You know, how did that come together?
Well, you know what? It really was a very strong bipartisan effort. I was invited to come into this bill by Senator Gillibrand, and this is an area that I've long been interested in, making sure that America is first really leading in some of this innovation. To be honest with you, I've heard a lot about crypto. I've heard a lot about blockchain, AI, all from young people who have said to me that they are interested in having this area regulated and that they wanted to make sure that all of this innovation was led by America. So this was a great opportunity for me to lean in. It was something we really worked hard on, but it was bipartisan, and today is a very satisfying result.
Well, all of that said, Senator, and we appreciate your making the run over. I know you just voted. You were on the floor, I think, 2 minutes ago. You were an original co-sponsor of this bill, as you're suggesting. And I wonder what message you have for Democrats who oppose this legislation because it did not have more strict language on limiting President Trump's ability to enrich himself in the crypto space. How do you answer that?
You know what? So this bill didn't have everything that any of us wanted. I am also a co-sponsor on a crypto bill that does prohibit the president, senior members of the cabinet, and family members from being involved in cryptocurrency. I'll say this is an unregulated area that is growing and moving quickly. We need to make sure it's happening globally, and we need to make sure that it is not only regulated in the United States of America, but that we are still present and that we're leading in these areas. So we work to have consumer protections. This was a part of the bill I worked on to make sure community banks were protected, to make sure that our security interests were protected. There were many, many amendments that happened over a long period of time. It didn't cover everything that we were concerned about, but I think it was a great bipartisan effort. And you know what? At the end of the day, our constituents expect us to be able to get things done, and this making these payments easier to make, making them opening up this digital currency area is going to be very helpful to many of our businesses, and I think it's an important step forward.
Well, I ask you that in part because of what we heard from President Biden's former economic advisor, Jared Bernstein, who wrote about the Genius Act, quote, "Unless you're a criminal, there are no uses for these currencies." Senator, he says if crypto disappeared tomorrow, the average person going about their business would not notice, but the politicians whose pockets they so lavishly line would notice. What does Mr. Bernstein not get about this?
Well, you know what? These stable coins are backed by the U.S. dollar, and we now have a regulatory framework. I think what people want is an area that is stabilized, that is regulated, and that gives the consumer the opportunity to make a decision about whether or not to engage in it. That's ultimately what people want, is for us to make it as safe as possible and then to give them the decision about whether or not to use this kind of digital currency.
Senator, I want to turn now to the tax bill. There is text out of the Senate, but essentially, what recourse do Democrats have with Republicans in control? Because I know that you and many of your colleagues have a lot of problems with it, but what recourse is there right now?
Well, you know what? We are still working to understand all of the various aspects of the bill. Of course, we're very concerned about what it means. I hope the consumers understand that, and at the end of the day, what it really means is that the billionaires continue to get richer, and they do so on the backs of everyday hardworking families who will have more expensive health care, who will have their nutritional programs cut, who will have many other measures that are designed for middle-class families to survive, that it will become more expensive while we're all the while enriching billionaires. So that's what this is about. It means that this is something certainly that I don't support. I think many others will not support. And as a matter of fact, you know what? I think that the more and more Americans hear how we are balancing on the backs of hardworking, working-class families this tax benefit for billionaires, I think they too will agree that this is something that is really not good, either for our economy, because it grows the deficit by many trillions of dollars, and it also harms everyday hardworking families.
Senator Alsobrooks, I want to ask you about your colleague, Democratic Senator Alex Padilla of California, who returned to the Senate floor today after last week's incident in which he was thrown to the floor by federal agents, handcuffed and detained. Take a listen.
Before I could even get out my question, I was physically and aggressively forced out of the room. Even as I repeatedly announced I was a United States Senator, I was forced to the ground. First on my knees, and then flat on my chest. And as I was handcuffed and marched down a hallway, repeatedly asking, why am I being detained? Not once did they tell me why.
That, of course, took place at a news conference being held by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Senator, I only have about a minute left, and I'm sorry to limit your time on this, but there are great questions about, after this incident, what happened in Minnesota last weekend, about the safety of lawmakers. Do you feel safe at work? Do you feel safe at home?
Well, I think we're certainly endangering the lives of so many in public service. I think our rhetoric has grown coarse and violent, and I think we have to really tone it down. I think what happened to Senator Padilla is outrageous and disgusting, but be clear, the only reason this is happening is because President Trump hopes to change the subject. He does not want the average American to hear that he is giving tax breaks to billionaires at the expense of their health care.
Thank you, Senator. Democratic Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland, live from Capitol Hill. We appreciate your insights. Be sure to tune in to the premiere of Bloomberg's Originals Bullish with Shonali Bosick. It's coming up 6 p.m. Eastern here on Bloomberg TV. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg TV and Radio.